Welcome to the second tutorial of the afternoon. So my name is Francisco Flores. I'm a research scientist at the Massachusetts General Hospital and also at MIT. So I'm going to be giving you like very basic and compressed introduction to the field of neuroscience. And I'm going to be focusing a lot in like concepts and jargons that you're probably going to be hearing like over the course. For example, during the optimization tutorial, the spiking was already mentioned. So I will try to make like that concept like concrete and give it like a biophysical interpretation. So first things first, the neuron. So the neuron is the basic building block of the brain, and the whole nervous system really. So just like any other cell in your body, it has a soma, which is this area here, and it has a nucleus, which is this red dot here. But different from other cells in your body, the neuron also has these particular projections that you can see here that are called dendrites, and it has this other projection that is the one emanating here, that is the axon. And the axon terminates in what is called the synaptic terminals. Some neurons are surrounded by what is called Schwann cells. Not all of them, particularly in the brain, they don't have this particular specialization, but typically in the more peripheral nervous system, you will find this. And we might actually talk about what this helps and what it means. So first, the most basic concepts about the neuron: the membrane potential and the action potential. So the membrane potential particularly refers to, as any good cell, the neuron is surrounded by a membrane, which is a lipid layer. And it's particularly going to refer to what happens here in the soma of the neuron. So to make things simple, let's start with a model. So in this case, the most simple model you can imagine, this is a container that has water on it, okay? And you are able to put a separation here, a barrier, that is going to separate this container in these two different sections. Now, like any good water, you can dissolve a salt on it. So imagine that you can dissolve like table salt, like sodium chloride. And by some kind of magic, you can actually separate the sodium channels from the chloride channels. So you have only positive charges on one side and only negative charges on the other side. So basically, you have a charge separation, okay, in this container. Now, if you were to measure what's the potential difference between these two parts of the container, you're going to find that it's going to be 0 millivolt. Why? Because of this separation you have here, there's actually no current flow. So there's no ionic movement in between the two sections of the container. If the current is 0, by Ohm's law, the voltage is going to be 0. Okay? So now let's make things more interesting. And let's add a couple like holes in this membrane that you have separation. Now these holes are very special in the sense that the blue one only allows the movement of negative charges, okay? And the red one only allows the movement of positive charges. And because you have positive charges on this side, the negative charges are going to move in that direction. And because here you only have negative charges, the positive charges are going to move in this direction. So you know, like positive is attracted by negative and the opposite, okay? So now you have been able to establish some sort of like transient ion movement, which is actually a current. It's an ionic current. It's different from an electronic current where you have electron movement. So here the ions are the ones that are carrying the actual current. Now, at the same time, so here you have like one of the negative guys move to the other side and one of the positive guys move to this side. So you have a slight charge imbalance. And at the same time, you are able to put this device here, which is a pump. And this pump is making its best effort to bring this blue guy back to this side and the red guy back to the other side. So now you have established actually a current flow. And if you can measure that, and if there was a neuron, it's going to be minus 65 millivolts. And actually, this is more or less how the neuron is. So the neuron has the intracellular part of the neuron has a negative charge, and the extracellular part of the neuron has a positive charge, okay? And in reality, what the neuron has is these proteins that are here that are called the ion channels. So there are some ion channels that are passive, and basically these are pores in the neuron that are always open. And I just, the model that I just showed, I showed movement of negative ions and positive ions. Now in reality, in the neurons, the negative ions are not moving. But what you have is like potassium ions that are typically going outside, sodium ions that are typically coming inside, and the pump, which is called the sodium-potassium pump, is the one that keeps the imbalance. How does that? So the pump is going to move 3 sodiums outside and 2 sodiums inside, or 2 potassiums inside. So there will always be this slight positive imbalance, and because the negative charges, which are typically chloride ions, are going to stay the same, you will have a slight negative charge inside the neuron. So the neuron is going to be negative charge inside, and it's going to be positive charge outside. And in normal conditions, that's going to be the resting potential. So if you have, in this graph, time in this axis, and voltage in millivolts in this axis, and this is the minus 65 point, which is the resting potential. Let's say if you have a neuron that is isolated and it's nothing's really going on, the neuron is going to be, and if you're able to measure the potential that is across the membrane of the neuron, the potential is going to be always minus 65. Now let's say that you can provide an input to this neuron, basically in the form of like providing some sort of current, external current. If that input drives the membrane potential towards like 0, that's called a depolarization. So basically you're depolarizing the membrane potential. If you stop your input right there, the membrane potential is gonna repolarize back towards the resting potential, okay? Now if you are able to provide an input in the opposite direction, so basically like providing negative currents, you're gonna produce what is called a hyperpolarization. So whenever the neuron moves like towards potentials that are more negative compared to the resting potential, that is called a hyperpolarization. Now, depolarization and hyperpolarization are related to 2 concepts that I'm going to try to explain later, but it's important to introduce now. It is EPSP and IPSP. So an EPSP is an excitatory postsynaptic potential, so basically a potential that produces an depolarization, and IPSP is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, so it's going to produce a hyperpolarization. Now, that's all well and good during the resting period. Now the neuron not only has these resting ion channels, but also has a more particular kind of channels that are called the voltage-gated ion channels. So these channels are just like the other ones, so it's like protein that has a hole in the middle. But these channels have what is called like a voltage sensor or a gate, which is this ball and chain part of the protein that you can see here. So in normal conditions, these guys, so at the resting potential, these guys are blocking the pore. So they are preventing the entrance of sodium to the neuron. But if you are able to drive the membrane potential high enough such to reach the threshold when these voltage sensors are going to move out of the pore, then this channel is going to be open and it's going to allow for the influx of sodium. So let's see how that happens. Again, we have the same graph. Now this expanded in the y-axis, so we have the same minus 65, which is the resting potential. We have hit the threshold point, which could be typically around minus 50, minus 55 millivolts. And here we have the 0. So just like before, we are in the resting potential, and we introduce a little input. So the membrane is going to depolarize. If we just stop there, nothing's going to happen. The membrane is going to repolarize again, okay? But if I introduce a second input right after I finish the second one, and the membrane potential reaches what is called the threshold for gating the sodium channel, which we just saw before, there's going to be a huge sodium influx, which is going to result in a net depolarization of the membrane that is actually going to overshoot over the 0. So at this very point, what I said before, that the neuron is typically has a negative charge inside and a positive charge outside, is going to reverse. It's going to have a positive charge inside and a negative charge outside. Now, sodium will keep on going, but 2 things are going to happen. Here, the sodium channels, which I just showed you before, even though they're still open, they inactivate. So they will not allow more influx of sodium. And another thing that's going to happen is that the potassium channels, that are voltage sensors also, are going to open here, and there will be a huge efflux of potassium outside. Remember that now the neuron is negative outside, So the potassium, which is positive, is going to move to the other side. At the same time, the pump that I just mentioned is going to be making its best effort to bring things to normal. So this is going to actually repolarize the neuron towards the resting potential, and actually it's going to undershoot. So it's going to hyperpolarize it for a short period of time, typically 1 millisecond. So when the neuron is in this refractory period here, doesn't matter how high the input that is coming, is not going to fire another action potential. So that's what is called the refractory period, the absolute refractory period, and it lasts typically like 1 millisecond, which is when you can see the value of this of the voltage here. Now slowly the neuron is going to go back towards the resting potential, which is around minus 65, until some new input comes in. And well, the action potential is also known typically as an impulse or a spike. So when you hear like spiking neuron, it's basically the firing of action potentials. And this is basically the way that the neuron sends, communicates with other neurons. So these action potentials actually, before that, this is how things look in reality. So this is an actual recording that includes the membrane potential that is here, and action potentials from a neuron in the hippocampus of a rat. And so you can see here like this, at this point something happens, so the membrane potential goes up, and then there is a burst of action potential. So when more than one action potential happen in close proximity, typically less than 20 milliseconds, we call that a burst. Now the input disappears, the neuron repolarizes, and then another action potential. Here a little bit of depolarization happens, but the neuron typically oscillates around the resting potential. Here we have a huge burst of spikes. Now if I zoom in this area, you can see typically things are not that, like kind of like in resting state. There is a lot of activity always. And it's typically in a neuron that is within, like a live brain or even in a slice of brain. It's very difficult to find out which the actual resting potential is, because it's always going to be fluctuating around some number, and it's actually impossible also to differentiate when inhibitory inputs are coming or when excitatory inputs are coming. But the idea is like whenever the action potential goes around the threshold, which is going to be around here, it's going to be firing action potentials. And if it stays there, you're going to get a burst of action potentials. Now, this action potential, as I said before, is the way that the neuron communicates with other neurons. And they are actually initiated here, which is when the sum of the neuron ends and the axon of the neuron starts, and it's called the axon haloc. That area of the neuron is very rich on sodium voltage-gated channels. So that's what senses, the changes in the membrane potential. All the membrane potential changes are happening here. But whenever they are high enough that they can open the guys that exist here, they're going to fire an action potential in that direction. So what's going to happen is that the sodium is going to come in, the neuron is going to be transiently positive inside and negative outside. And at the very limit of this area, the voltage-gated sodium channels, which are located here, the axon is very rich in voltage-gated sodium channels all around. They're going to start opening. So then the next area is going to leave this sodium going in, and the potassium is going to start going out from the area that they just initiated the action potential, okay? And this is how the action potential travels across the axon. Because this area here, and it just keeps on going in. And because this area here is actually in the refractory period, this guy cannot go back. So that ensures that the action potential is always going to go in one direction. Now, if you were, to somehow cheat and introduce a stimulus here, then you have an action potential that is going to be traveling both ways. But in normal physiological conditions, where the action potential is initiated here, it's only going to move in that direction, which is called the orthodromic direction. Now, the action potential is going to travel to the axon, and it's going to reach here the synaptic terminals. Now, everything will be very boring with only one neuron, even though the action just studying this part has granted several Nobel Prizes. But it's interesting to see what happens when you have another neuron. So that's called the synaptic transmission, okay?
The same ion that never travels along the whole axon?
Pardon me?
The same molecule, the same ion, does not travel?
No, it's a locally generated. Yeah. So that's the synaptic transmission. It's when a neuron makes contact with another neuron. So here there is a little schematic on how that happens. This is the axon. These are the synaptic terminals at the end of the axon of neuron 1, let's call the red neuron. And they are making contact with the dendrites, or also with the soma. In this case, it's not shown, but they might also make contact with the soma of the second neuron. So this will be the presynaptic neuron, and this will be the postsynaptic neuron. Okay? So the action potential is coming this way, and it's going to reach these synaptic terminals right here. And what happens there is a transduction process where the action potential with an ionic current is coming here. And here the synaptic terminal is full of these vesicles. And these vesicles have different kinds of molecules. And these molecules, when the electricity, when the depolarization reaches the action potential, these vesicles are going to move towards the end of the synaptic vesicle of the presynaptic neuron. And they are going to release the chemicals that they contain. And these chemicals are going to travel to this very tight space, which is called the synaptic cleft, and are going to make contact with the next neuron, which is the postsynaptic neuron. In here, they are going to bind to other kind of proteins, which are also channels. But in this case, these channels are not voltage gated, but are gated by these chemicals. So whenever this protein gets in contact with this particular chemical here, it's going to open, and it's going to allow, again, either potassium, sodium or potassium, also chloride, sometimes calcium influx, and it's going to change the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron, and the process is going to keep on going. Okay? So this is what allows you to have like chains and circuits within the brain. So this is, for example, is a staining of the cortex, of a section of the cortex of a human. I think this is visual cortex in a human. So you can see that this is an array of, you can see the neuron bodies here, which is typically arranged in layers. So these are all chains of neurons that are connected between them, like sending connections towards the other neurons into upper layers. Sometimes these guys are also sending connections towards the neurons in lower layers. They are receiving connections from like other areas of the brain, and they are sending connections to other areas of the brain. This is another example of how this particular pattern repeats across the brain. This is the motor cortex of probably the same person, of a human. So even though it looks kind of different in the end, the same pattern appears. So you have layers. There's typically 6 layers. For example, layer 6, layer 5, layer 4, layer 2, 3, layer 2, and layer 1, which is right here. So if we have a cartoon of this, we can see here that these are more the layers specified. And another kind of neuron that is not very visible here shows up, which is like these guys that you can see here. These are inhibitory neurons. So there's basically 2 kinds of synapses. The excitatory synapse, which is a synapse that is going to produce EPSP, an excitatory postsynaptic potential in the postsynaptic neuron. And there is the inhibitory synapse, which is the one that is going to produce a hyperpolarization, or an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So the typical, the molecule that produces the excitation is glutamate, and the typical molecule that produces the inhibition is GABA. Anatomically, this is also kind of different. Typically, the excitatory connections happen in the dendrites, and the inhibitory connections happen in the soma of the neuron. So kind of like to summarize, whenever glutamate is involved and it happens in the dendrite, there will be a depolarization of the membrane potential in that neuron. And whenever like GABA or an IPSP, an inhibitory connection happens, there's going to be a hyperpolarization. So basically, glutamate and GABA, the excitatory and inhibitory components of the brain, are working like one against the other. And you can imagine that this makes a lot of sense, and it's actually very important, because if you only have excitatory chains of neurons, then you're going to get too far. And actually, that's called epilepsy. When there is a problem with the inhibition in the brain, that's a seizure. And the whole condition is called epilepsy. So you need this inhibitory, which in the cortex are typically local circuits, to sort of like provide some sort of like braking mechanism for the transmission of the activity. Now this results in what is called the cortical microcircuit, which is the kind of like a canonical form of how the cortex neurons are arranged. And this is repeated, as I showed before, like motor cortex, visual cortex, prefrontal cortex. They all have the same basic arrangement where you have like different layers The black guys here are like excitatory neurons, which have like more like long-range projections within layers and outside the cortex also. The red guys are the inhibitory neurons, which are typically more local. Within the cortex, there's no like long-range inhibitory projections. And then these guys here receive like the forward connections that are coming from other cortical areas or from some subcortical areas. And they also receiving like the feedback connections that are typically coming from higher cortical areas. And this is basically the basic building block that forms the cortex. And that allows for like a huge like amount of specializations of the cortex, even though the basic circuit is the same. Yeah.
What is the chemical reaction between the, say, GABA or that makes the gates open? If it's not electrical?
Oh yeah, no, it is. So what happens is like the GABA channel is a chloride channel. So it's going to move a negative ion. So it's going to make like the inside of the neuron like more negative than it really was, before. So it's going to bring it towards the hyperpolarized side. Yeah, yeah. The glutamate is going to typically move sodium. So that's going to make it like more positive and it's going to depolarize. So basically that basic, very basic like layer and microcircuit and that connection between like excitatory and inhibitory neurons is what makes possible the whole variety of functions that the cortex has, and that probably most of you know better than I do, like the visual cortex right here in the back, like the speech areas, which are these, the emotional areas, which is like inside the inner part of the cortex. Everything is just made possible, but that particular arrangement of excitatory and inhibitory neurons in layers. So now let's take a look at a simple example of how this happens, which is visual perception, which is the typical way that, and the best study way that this happens. So this is kindergarten physiology, the eye. So typically the light will come on and it's going to hit the retina. The retina has this array of like photoreceptors, which are right here, which are the ones that transduce the photonic energy of the light into an electrical signal. These are actually not neurons, these are just receptors, so they don't fire action potentials. They just change their membrane potential depending on the amount of light and in the color of the light. Okay? But the guys that come later, those are actual neurons, they change the sense of the receptors, and they're going to be firing action potentials that are going to travel all the way within the cortex toward the thalamus. In the thalamus, there is another relay. So these neurons are going to receive the output from the retina, and it's going to send the output towards the primary visual cortex. And here I want to show you like an actual experiment that was done by Hubel and Wiesel, who won the Nobel Prize for actually discovering how the neurons in the primary visual cortex respond to different like features of the world. So I'm going to escape this. And I think I have to bring it. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Let's just make it like that. All right. So what you're about to see is recording that we typically call it of a neuron in the primary visual area of an anesthetized cat. So what you will see here in the screen is the actual stimulus that Hubel and Wiesel were presenting to that cat during the experiment. And most importantly, what you're going to hear, like a popping sound, is the action potentials being fired by the neuron that they are recording. So because the action potential is just a change of voltage over time, I mean, it can be fit through any particular, so to any kind of like a headphone or any sound device, amplified, and then actually you can hear it. So that's the neuron firing. So there you can see, as soon as that bright bar appears, more or less in that area, the neurons like increases the firing rate. So that's why we call the firing rate of the neuron is like the number of action potentials per second that are being fired. So you see the neuron fires a lot whenever the bar light is here. But when they move it to this area, nothing really happens. Same here. So whenever the bar is here or here, the neuron doesn't really fire. So it only fires during this, when the stimulus is presented in this area of the visual field. Now a bigger stimuli. So with that, they have been able to identify that this neuron has a receptive field like this shape, where the neuron fires a lot whenever the stimulus is presented in this orientation, only in this orientation, and doesn't fire at all when it's presented right next to either side of that area. So this is called the on area of the receptive field, and these are the off areas of the receptive field. Here they're going to show that it's orientation selective. Nothing happens. A little bit. So as you get closer to the right orientation, and there you go. And that's the maximum. Nothing happens. So basically, these neurons are behaving as edge detectors. So they can detect, a edge in a particular orientation. And different neurons, probably the neuron that is right next to this one, is going to respond to an orientation instead of this, is going to respond better to this. The neuron that is maybe a little bit more there in the visual cortex is going to respond to a more like horizontal orientation. So you have a whole array of neurons that are responding to different orientations. So now if we go back to this slide, this one. The recordings were being made in this area, which is the primary visual cortex right here. But this area is receiving the input from the thalamus, which is this area right here. So the retina sends to the thalamus, connects to a neuron here, and then this neuron sends the spikes to the visual cortex. Now, one good question is like, how does the receptive field of these neurons here look? And the answer is like, they have this kind of receptive field. So it's different from the one that we saw before. So in this case, they fire the best to spots of light. And they don't fire at all whenever the light is presented in the surrounding area of that particular spot. There are two kinds of neurons. They are on-center and off-surrounds. Basically, they fire more when the light is presented in the spot, and they don't fire when it's presented around, like a kind of like donut shape. And then there is off-center and on-surround, which is like when fire more when the donut is presented and there's nothing in the center. And they don't fire at all when the stimulus is presented right in the center of the. Now this gave rise to the most simple computational model, but it is still in use today, which is the orientation selective cells of B1 that we just saw with their center that is oriented, that has a negative area around, is produced by the combination of the LGN cells. So if you have several of these cells that are arranged in a particular orientation, you're going to produce this on area here from the on centers of the LGN cells, and you're going to produce the off surround from the off areas of the LGN cells. And this model is still in use today, I will say. Another thing I should mention, if you remember the talk from optimization when they showed the sparse functions. So they look like Gabor functions, which is basically the way typically these guys are modeled here. So you have like a peak and then a valley, and that's typically the Gabor function. So beyond V1, the projections of the visual cortex are divided in two main pathways. So one is the WER pathway. As you saw, maybe it wasn't that clear in that video, but some neurons in V1 are more responsive when the stimulant is coming from the top than when it's coming from the bottom. So they are also like direction selective. So they can sense like the movement of the stimulus. And typically those cells project towards like the more parietal cortex of the brain, where here there are cells that are very specialized in detecting movement and detecting like where objects are. On the other side, some other cells project more towards this what is called the what pathway, where neurons are more specialized into detecting what the objects are. So representations here become like more and more abstract, and these neurons are, instead of like responding towards like simple bars or simple dots, they can respond to actual faces or like more complicated shapes. And basically that gives rise to the same kind of diagram that Professor Pollo showed in his introductory talk, when you can build this sort of like feed-forward, even feedback networks, going from simple features towards more complicated features. And you can try to explain, how the perception of complicated features, actually objects that are moving, happens using this sort of like model that are typically inspired by V1 physiology, as you showed. So kind of like for closing the circle, like towards the kind of stuff that you're going to be doing. This is basically how physiology and how these very basic experiments, even in an anesthetized animal, can inform the kind of like architectures that are going to be used to build, these detectors and different kind of classification technology and all of that. So with that, I would like to finish. Thank you. And if there's any question.
How do you know that the LGN neurons that fire like on the circle or off the circle, they are related to the edge detector neurons? How do you know they are related in that way?
Oh yeah, that's a model. It's a proposed model. Yeah, on how that happens, yes. Yeah, I mean, there are several things that are still not very well understood. For example, something that is still striking is like from V1, there is a lot of projections towards the LGN. So there is like LGN goes to V1 and then V1 to LGN, and there is a massive projection. And no one still knows what exactly is going on there, what is that projection doing. So like the feedback is still kind of like a mystery. Yeah.
Massive relative even to the feed-forward? So comparing the neurons that fire from the LGN to the V1 from LGN, is the first one, are there many more feed-forward and feedback?
No, what there is more, so the LGN receives more input from other areas than the input that sends to V1. Yeah. So it's massive in the sense that the LGN is receiving a lot of input from other areas more than the one that is sending to the V1. Aha, very good question. Yeah. So in that case, the cat was anesthetized, so no saccades there. But yeah, yeah, the saccades are a big problem in that sense because they have been the crux of electrophysiology. So in cats, doesn't really matter because the cats almost don't move the eyes really much. Yeah. Now in monkeys becomes a problem. The order 0 solution is to train the monkey to fixate in a point, so basically you don't get saccades. But the saccades are typically a very interesting topic of study because your visual acuity, and this is what I was doing before, if you extend your arm like this and you look at your thumb, that's the only point that you can actually resolve anything in the visual space with a decent resolution, that you can actually see things that are not blurry. But actually, when I look at the world, I see everything kind of like at once, right? So that's because my eyes are performing, this constant scanning, and my brain is filling in all the lacks of images that I'm not getting all the time. So saccades are very interesting, and definitely they do modulate the activity of B1. So in B1, if we go to the simpler case, there are neurons that will increase their firing rate whenever a saccade happens. Some other ones will decrease their firing rate whenever a saccade happens. Now there's not much studies, to my knowledge, on how that will interact with the perception of like the bars or like some other more complex stimuli.
So I have a question about neural versus non-neural cells and processing in those. So non-neural cells also have gap junctions and voltage kind of channels or voltage-gated channels. Is what makes neurons special in processing information the fact that they can specify just one or a number of additional cells to activate, and it's the information flow through them?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, most cells, I think maybe all cells, have like this resting potential. Right. Yeah. But I will say that only neurons have voltage-gated channels. But you have neurons all over the body. That's the most important thing. Someone, not only in the nervous system, for example, like the gut, someone said, I am not sure, don't quote me on this, but there's more neurons in the gut than in the brain. There is a lot because it's very necessary to produce these sort of like peristaltic movements. So that happens through the pancreas, has also lots of neurons, like particularly inhibitory neurons that inhibit the release of insulin. And those have nothing to do with the nervous system. So yeah, there are other neurons. So to my knowledge, only neurons have voltage-gated channels. Yeah. Okay. I can produce the action potential, but several other neurons have this sort of resting potential. They do have for sure. They can do some like slight changes in this resting potential. So they have some graded potential, like the photoreceptors, or other receptors. Yeah.
Not all neurons fire, right?
Not all neurons fire. That's a good question.
That don't fire, and there are some astrocytes that do have voltage-gated channels.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. So which neurons don't fire?
We keep forgetting what's the name of that cell on the right hand, like hemacrine something cell.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the section makes the rule. Yeah. Yeah.
The distinction is tricky.
Yeah. And actually, glial cells, they do have like changes in potential, but it's very slow. So it's typically less, if we're talking here like 0.1 hertz, 0.01 hertz, so it's very, plants have action potentials. So a very slow action potential, but they do have, so some plants do. So yeah, it's not really unique. Yeah. That's a good point. And me as an electrophysiologist, I have to deal with that on a daily basis. So, yeah. Kind of like here. So not this one, but the first one. Here. Okay, yeah. So, well, I said that the membrane potential changes happen like from the dendrites, the soma. The dendrites are typically the depolarizing ones. In the soma are typically the hyperpolarizing ones. They combine in a complex fashion, and whenever they reach the threshold, the axon hillock is going to sense that, and it's going to send the action potential that way. Yes. Now, the action potential can also backpropagate. Yes. Now the thing is that the backpropagation, because there's no voltage-gated sodium channels in the body of the neuron, not in the dendrites, that backpropagation is like what we call electrotonic, so it's passive. So it's basically the kind of thing that happens in like cable theory, like if you inject a current through a cable, it's just going to travel for some time until it's going to decay at some point. So that's why you need to have generators every so often in order to keep the thing going. So that's what you get here. It's an electrotonic backpropagation of the action potential that is going to decay more or less quickly. So yeah. So typically, let's say if you were like observing the activity of the neuron, you might actually be able to see the backpropagating action potential, like seeing one peak here and then another peak following immediately. That is going to be the guy going back. Now there is another phenomenon which is called the dendritic spikes. Dendritic spikes, which is like the spikes, even though they don't have these voltage gating channels, they do have neurotransmitter gated channels. And the NMDA channels, can produce a huge influx of calcium. And the calcium is going to produce also a huge depolarization that even though it's slower, it might last for like 5, 10 milliseconds. It's still, it looks kind of like a spike, so we call it a calcium spike. So dendrites, so that spike is going to stay only in the dendrite, and it's going to have some effects on the local dendrite computations. It's not going to travel through the axon, but it's definitely something that is affecting how synaptic input is being integrated, and it's traditionally been very difficult to study, but right now some people is actually doing it, and they're coming up with very, very interesting results. So how the computations, typically one looks at the action potential, so the spike, like 0, 1, fires, don't fire, and then we come up with codes and everything, and there is a lot going on here. That just because we don't know doesn't really mean that it's not interesting, and there's some people trying to do it now. It's very difficult because you have to actually be able to visualize the dendrites and to put an electrode and record their activity. So, but with today's technology, it's possible, and some people is doing it. Yeah. Actually, Diego Mendoza on Saturday, he's going to go over everything that I didn't mention today, which is actually how do you obtain these recordings, which is like the methodology that is being used to study this phenomenon. Cool. Yeah.
Apparently there is something that is called synaptic weights. So when you have an image you want, so they are stored in sort of weighted way. How they are.
So yeah, so well, when I set this part, like I just mentioned 2 kinds of synapses. By lie, there is actually a lot more kind of synapses. So these are the faster ones, are the most common, and the ones that are more important for the generation of action potentials and like things that are happening on fast time scales. But there is another one that it will require another chapter, but that is called the NMDA receptor. So the NMDA receptor is called the coincidence receptor. So because whenever an EPSP happens in close proximity to where the NMDA receptors are, this guy, if there is, let's say, a lot of input coming, so the neuron is depolarized for a long time, and there is NMDA receptors around this area that is being depolarized, these guys are going to open. And they will produce a huge influx of calcium, which is going to produce a further depolarization, and it's going to trigger changes that are going to go towards the DNA and produce the transcription of new NMDA channels that are going to travel back to the membrane, and they're going to increase the synaptic weight, in the sense that that synapse is going to be more powerful because there's more NMDA receptors, which can produce this big depolarization. So you have more chances of producing an action potential downstream whenever you have this mechanism. So the NMDA receptor can sense, this, particularly let's say if you have a synapse that is getting input from 2 neurons, it's more likely to get action potential from both guys. So it's going to be more active. So it's more likely to produce this sort of potentiation. That's the potentiation that is mediated by the NMDA receptors. That's how different synaptic weights can happen, and that's what the physiological correlate of learning had been proposed to be.
What about neurons like neuroplasticity? Neurons connecting to other neurons or with more dendrites?
Yeah, so that's a similar thing, I believe, but also it might happen that new synaptic terminals might grow. Just because of the increased activity around a given area of synaptic terminals when their neurons are connecting with other. There are also transcriptional and genomic changes that can produce the growth of new synaptic terminals. So not only through the NMDA, but also through actually increasing the number of synapses that are around that neuron. I'm not really very on top of what that mechanism is, but that also might happen, yeah. And all of that is related to changing the synaptic weights of so as you can see, it's very similar to kind of the neural networks models which are inspired by this sort of physiology. That's why what Professor Pollo was saying, that it's very important to do basic research in order to inspire like the future, like engineering. It's exactly because that's, I mean, all of the research that I show was probably done in like the 50s or 60s, and it's inspired, like the new kind of like technologies that are being used for classification and learning and machine learning and all of that. Okay, thank you so much.